On the plains of Montana in late June of 1876, a confrontation erupted that would expose a nation's deepest conflicts and leave a legacy that still shapes memory today. If you value careful, balanced history, please subscribe for more measured storytelling. Hear the sweep of the land first, rolling grass beneath a relentless sky, camps of families and warriors, cavalry units moving under orders from a distant capital. This was not a simple clash of personalities. It was the collision of expansionist policy, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, repeated treaty violations, and the determined defense of homeland and way of life by Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho communities. Over the next minutes we will trace how competing aims, military command decisions on one side, spiritual and communal leadership on the other, brought men and women to this place. We will listen to voices too often sidelined, native oral histories and the testimonies of soldiers, the strategies of leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and the orders and expectations that guided U.S. forces under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. We will avoid myth and examine the evidence, contemporaneous reports, archaeology, and scholarship, so you can see how narrative and reality diverge. Watch to understand why this encounter mattered beyond the battlefield, how it accelerated military campaigns, hardened policies that led to forced relocation, and became a contested symbol in American memory. By the end, you will have a clearer, more humane view of the causes, the perspectives on both sides, and the consequences that reached far beyond that single, fateful summer. Hook, a famous battle where victory became defeat. If you value careful historical storytelling, please consider subscribing for more measured accounts. When the United States Army 7th Cavalry advanced into a broad river valley, they encountered an enormous camp of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne, drawn together by resistance to broken treaties and the discovery of gold in lands guaranteed to them. Tensions had been rising for years as settlers, miners, and the federal government pressured indigenous homelands, and treaty guarantees were repeatedly violated. Military leaders saw action as enforcement of policy. Plains peoples saw defense of life, family, and sacred ground. Custer, a cavalry commander with a reputation for aggressive tactics, divided his regiment into separate battalions in an attempt to encircle and rout the camp. That decision, intended to create a swift victory, instead fragmented command and left one column isolated. Short flanking moves became fatal exposures. The opposing force was not a single faceless mass. It included war leaders such as Crazy Horse and Gall, and a spiritual leader, Sitting Bull, whose role in uniting warriors and civilians was central. Estimates of warrior strength vary, from 900 to 2,000, and the vast encampment included many more non-combatants. Numbers on paper did not capture the cohesion and local knowledge the indigenous fighters brought to the field. Reno's initial attack and subsequent retreat to timbered ground, Benteen's delayed approach, and the disappearance of Custer's 5 companies together formed a tactical narrative of miscommunication and miscalculation. Survivors and eyewitnesses on both sides recalled rapid movements, smoke, and desperate close fighting, but recollections diverge on many details. Short. From the native perspective, the encounter was an act of collective defense. From the Army's perspective, it became a shocking collapse that demanded explanation. Newspapers, political leaders, and military authorities turned the event into urgent cause for response, while indigenous accounts emphasized sovereignty, ceremony, and survival. The immediate consequence was not a lasting military triumph for the indigenous nations. Federal reaction hardened, reinforcements increased, and policies shifted toward confinement and assimilation. Over the following months and years, the United States intensified campaigns, and pressure on land rights and autonomy mounted. Long-term effects included the accelerated loss of traditional lifeways, forced relocations onto reservations, and the strengthening of narratives that mythologized figures on both sides. 4 decades popular culture framed the episode as a dramatic clash of heroes and villains, obscuring complex causes and lived realities. In the decades that followed, historians, descendants, and legal systems revisited the meanings and outcomes. Military archives, oral histories, and archaeological studies deepened understanding of tactics and human cost. Legal and political struggles over land, treaty rights, and recognition continued into the next century, producing both compensation claims and renewed efforts to understand justice beyond monetary awards. Quietly, the battle reshaped national policy and collective memory without resolving the deeper questions of sovereignty and restitution. A sober look at this confrontation shows how a tactical gamble intended to secure a quick victory can become a turning point with far-reaching consequences. It is a story of contested space and competing visions for the future, told through official reports and indigenous testimony alike. Still, the echo of that valley endures in lore, memory, and the lives of communities who trace their history to that valley sky. Why Little Bighorn still matters. The clash on the rolling hills along the river was not an isolated combat but a flashpoint of converging policies, economies, and worldviews that had been escalating for years. If you value measured historical storytelling, consider subscribing for more nuanced accounts. Expansionist pressure from settlers and miners pushed into lands that many indigenous nations regarded as central to their survival. Simultaneously, federal policies increasingly sought to confine those nations to prescribed reservation boundaries. This collision was fed by the rapid shrinking of the buffalo herds that sustained Plains life, by treaty promises that were repeatedly negotiated and broken, and by local decisions made under the weight of national politics and public expectation. On one side, the United States Army moved as an instrument of federal policy, tasked with enforcing the boundaries and laws that Congress and distant officials imposed. Command decisions were shaped by a mixture of strategic calculations, personal ambition, and imperfect information. Some officers believed a decisive demonstration of force would stabilize the region. Others saw any retreat as politically untenable. Communication problems, assumptions about indigenous military organization, and underestimates of enemy strength all played into the outcome without excusing the human costs. For the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and their allies, the encounter was rooted in a struggle to protect a way of life. Leaders who had long resisted confinement, among them noted figures whose names became symbols of resistance, gathered to defend a large seasonal camp whose people included hunters, families, and elders. Their actions were defensive and communal in character, not a bid for glory but a desperate effort to safeguard food supplies, sacred spaces, and the autonomy of distinct nations. Spiritual visions, counsel among elders, and pragmatic decisions in the face of scarcity shape how communities organized and fought. The repercussions radiated outward in ways that reshaped policy, memory, and identity. In the immediate aftermath, public shock and political debate intensified, prompting harsher military measures and tighter enforcement of reservation life. Over the longer term, the episode entered national mythmaking, influencing portrayals in newspapers, dime novels, and later film. That mythology often simplified realities, elevating a few figures while obscuring the broader context of dispossession and resistance. Today, the site and its stories are treated as contested heritage. Archaeological research, indigenous oral histories, and revised museum exhibits work in tandem to correct earlier narratives and to emphasize the perspectives that were once marginalized. Contemporary significance lies in how the event continues to inform dialogue about sovereignty, historical justice, and cultural survival. Educational curricula, legal claims, and commemorations increasingly recognize indigenous voices and the complex causes that led to the confrontation. The battle's legacy is thus not only about a military rout or a tactical victory, but also about policy consequences, communal resilience, and the long effort to reckon honestly with the past. In that ongoing conversation, the site endures as a reminder of competing claims over land, the high cost of broken promises, and the human capacity to remember and to seek redress. The Great Plains and Native Resistance. Subscribe for more historical narratives. The grasslands of the Great Plains extended in an unbroken sweep of prairie, river valleys, and rolling buttes that shaped the lifeways of the indigenous nations who called them home. Tribes such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and Arapaho organized economies and social systems around mobility, the seasonal migrations of bison, and intricate networks of trade and diplomacy. Teepees clustered along creek beds in warm months and emptied in the cold, following the herds. The landscape itself dictated strategy. Open sightlines favored horse-mounted hunting and warrior traditions, while river corridors connected peoples across vast distances. Pressure on that world came from multiple directions. Government policies that encouraged westward settlement collided with indigenous claims to land held through treaty and custom. Railroad construction and the steady flow of miners and settlers into sacred places, most notably the hill country that held spiritual meaning for many Lakota bands, broke the fragile agreements that had been negotiated. Commercial hunters slaughtered bison by the thousands for hides, driven by distant markets and facilitated by new transport lines, undermining the central resource of Plains life. Treaties promised boundaries and provisions, but enforcement was uneven and often biased towards settlers' interests. The result was a slow strangulation of autonomy. People were hungry. Promises went unkept. Native responses were not monolithic. Some leaders sought accommodation and peace through negotiation and legal channels. Others rejected the steady erosion of land and livelihood and moved toward collective resistance. Charismatic war leaders and spiritual figures emerged from within the bands, calling for defense of territory and lifeways. Councils were held across tribal lines, alliances formed and dissolved as conditions changed. From the indigenous side came assertions of sovereignty and moral outrage at treaty violations. From the US side came a sense of inevitability attached to expansion, and a belief that law and order required military enforcement. Each perspective reflected real stakes, survival and cultural continuity on one side, and economic opportunity and national policy on the other. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Skirmishes and punitive expeditions proliferated. Plains societies endured not only battlefield losses but also the disappearance of the bison, the imposition of reservation systems, and the steady encroachment of non-indigenous institutions and values. The short-term triumphs of resistance often prompted larger federal responses and accelerated campaigns to confine and control. Long-term legacies include legal battles over land and sovereignty, contested memory of events, and ongoing efforts by native nations to reclaim cultural heritage and assert treaty rights. The Great Plains remained a contested terrain, geographically, politically, and morally, where the collision between expansion and indigenous resistance reshaped the continent. Gold in the Black Hills. Subscribe for more historical explorations. When word spread that the forested spires and hidden gulches of the Black Hills contained gold, the peaceful geography of Paha Sapa was transformed into a landscape of competing claims. An expedition sent into the region confirmed the presence of precious metal and brought back reports that ignited a rush of prospectors and speculators. The influx did not happen quietly. It happened in violation of solemn agreements. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had recognized the Black Hills as Lakota territory, but the lure of wealth overwhelmed earlier commitments and set pressures in motion that were hard to contain. For the Lakota and their allies, the Black Hills were not simply a source of resources. They were the center of spiritual life, a place of origin stories and major ceremonies such as the Sun Dance, and a landscape woven into lore, memory, and identity. Miners and settlers arriving by wagon and by rumor treated the hills as a new frontier to be claimed and worked, often with little regard for treaties or for the sacred practices tied to the land. Confrontations followed, but so did quieter ruptures. Hunting grounds were disrupted, relocation of buffalo herds accelerated, and the rhythms of seasonal life were interrupted by sluice boxes and deep cuts into ravines. Prospectors came with different tools and different dreams. Some sought gold in creek beds with pans and sluices, while others pursued quartz veins with shafts and tunnels. Boom towns appeared almost overnight, makeshift streets, saloons, and improvised law. Deadwood, for example, became a focal point of the rush, drawing a rough-edged population that altered the social map of the region. Larger enterprises soon moved in as well. Hard rock operations grew into serious mines capable of long-term extraction, reshaping both economy and environment. The sudden demand for supplies and transit accelerated road building and later rail connections, binding the Black Hills ever more tightly to markets and to Washington. The consequences were profound and long-lasting. Attempts by the United States to purchase the Black Hills met with resistance and ultimately failed to reconcile competing claims, which in turn contributed to a cycle of increasing military presence and legal maneuvering. The immediate result was the dispossession and displacement of indigenous communities, and the dissolution of treaty protections that had been guaranteed on paper. Over the decades, the matter moved into courtrooms. In United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the federal judiciary recognized that the taking of the Black Hills had been unlawful and offered monetary compensation, an offer that the Sioux have refused in favor of insisting on the return of their land. Environmental scars and altered waterways remain visible, but perhaps more enduring is the cultural wound, a contested landscape that continues to be central to debates over sovereignty, memory, and justice. Broken treaties and rising tensions. For more carefully researched historical narratives, consider subscribing. When gold was reported in the Black Hills, long-standing promises written into treaties suddenly became negotiable in the eyes of many settlers and officials. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota, but that guarantee collided with the reality of an expanding frontier and an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer that confirmed mineral riches. Miners streamed into land that indigenous nations regarded as sacred, and federal authorities faced relentless pressure to open those lands to settlement. Promises of protection and permanence, once formalized on paper, were slowly undermined by economic appetite and political expedience. Treaties were not only broken by new incursions, they were eroded by a pattern of unfulfilled obligations. Annuities, food rations, and supplies promised in exchange for land and peace were often delayed, mismanaged, or siphoned off by corrupt agents. Railroad expansion cut across hunting grounds, and commercial buffalo hunters decimated the herds that sustained plains societies. From the native perspective, ceremony and subsistence were under siege. Leaders such as Sitting Bull articulated a refusal to cede sacred ground, while warriors and chiefs across Lakota and Cheyenne bands debated whether to maintain life on the reservations or return to the plains to follow the buffalo and their traditions. From the federal and settler viewpoint, treaties that impeded access to valuable resources were increasingly seen as impediments to national growth. Officials proposed payments and land purchases that many indigenous leaders rejected as insufficient and dishonorable. Enforcement measures escalated into military patrols and arrests, and the language of law quickly shifted to label non-compliant groups as hostile. The result was a growing cycle of mistrust. Indigenous people experienced dispossession and starvation, and many who left reservations to sustain their communities were treated as rebels rather than people defending their livelihoods. The consequences of these broken agreements and mounting tensions reached far beyond any single engagement. After armed clashes, national sentiment hardened and policy turned toward punitive campaigns, accelerated confinement to reservations, and further loss of indigenous autonomy. Decades later, legal decisions acknowledged the wrongs of land seizure. One High Court ruling in 1980 recognized that the taking had been unlawful, but the remedy offered was monetary compensation, which many tribes declined because the land itself could not be replaced. The breach of treaties before and around Little Bighorn thus left a legacy of legal disputes, cultural trauma, and a contested memory that continues to shape conversations about justice and restitution. General Custer and the 7th Cavalry. If you find this study worthwhile, consider subscribing for more historical analyses. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry on a mission that combined traditional military objectives with political pressure to open contested lands. The regiment had been tasked with enforcing federal policies and protecting settlers and prospectors who were pressing into territory long used by Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands. Custer's command was drawn from regular cavalry companies supplemented by volunteers, and his orders reflected Washington's insistence on the removal of native resistance to settlement and resource extraction. The context was complex: treaty promises, the discovery of gold in sacred places, and an administration determined to assert control through military means. Custer's personality shaped how the campaign unfolded. He was a flamboyant figure, prone to bold action and public gestures that served both his career and the Army's expectations. Many officers admired his audacity. Some criticized his caution in equal measure. He divided his command into separate battalions on the approach to a large native encampment, a decision rooted in his aggressive doctrine and confidence in rapid, decisive strikes. That choice would prove consequential. Subordinates such as Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen carried out orders that later became focal points in debates over discipline, communication, and responsibility. Native leaders approached the confrontation from an entirely different perspective. For Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, the struggle was about survival and sovereignty. It was a defense of homeland, cultural practices, and the migratory life of the buffalo herds. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were not merely military figures but embodiments of communal resistance. The encampment that the Army encountered represented a large, intertribal gathering, including non-combatants. The native response combined tactical skill, intimate knowledge of terrain, and collective will. They fought to protect families and resources, and their successes on the field forced a hard reassessment of military assumptions. The immediate aftermath reshaped public opinion and policy. The deaths of commanding officers and many troopers stunned a nation and galvanized calls for decisive reprisals, which in turn accelerated military campaigns against remaining independent bands. The 7th Cavalry's reputation transformed overnight from a symbol of frontier security to a subject of controversy, myth, and inquiry. Army dispatches, congressional hearings, and newspaper accounts fixed an image that would be retold and contested for generations. Investigations scrutinized command decisions, reconnaissance failures, and logistical planning, while popular narratives often simplified complex causes into heroism or folly. Longer-term consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. The engagement hardened federal resolve to subdue resistance and hasten policies that confined native nations to reservations, restricted their movements, and limited access to traditional food sources. Cultural loss and demographic upheaval followed. At the same time, historians and communities have continued to reassess the episode, parsing motivations, errors, and the interplay of power. The story of Custer and the 7th Cavalry remains a cautionary study in leadership, intelligence, and the human costs of contested expansion. It urges reflection on how policy, prejudice, and military force intersect, and on whose voices have been prioritized in the telling. The Native Alliance gathers. Subscribe for more historical narratives. Leaders from several Plains nations, principally bands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, assembled in a vast riverside encampment to confront an accelerating threat to their homelands and lifeways. The gathering was neither accidental nor spontaneous. It was the culmination of mounting pressures, repeated treaty violations, demands that nomadic peoples abandon buffalo hunting, and the influx of settlers and miners into sacred territories. Spiritual preparation and political deliberation ran side by side, with delegations arriving from distant wintering grounds, bringing news, brides, children, and herds of ponies that would be essential for mobility and defense. Councils were held in the open, beneath wind-scoured skies, and decisions were reached through consensus rather than command. Sitting Bull's stature as a spiritual leader drew many to his circle after a powerful vision, while war leaders such as Crazy Horse and Gall carried the responsibility of organizing warriors and directing tactics. Women and elders shaped logistics and morale. They tended the sick, arranged supplies, and maintained the teepees that housed families who would follow decisions made at the council. Scout networks relayed sightings of army columns and wagons. Horses, dried meat, and the ability to move quickly were as vital as any strategy discussed in the council lodge. Perspectives diverged sharply across the plain. For many indigenous leaders, the assembly was a defensive necessity, an effort to protect hunting grounds and cultural practices from legal edicts and armed incursions. They spoke of the buffalo, not only as food but as the axis of an entire social and ceremonial world. For the United States, military patrols and columns were framed as law enforcement and protection for settlers, yet their presence intensified fear among the camps and made large congregations of people a lightning rod for confrontation. These competing logics, survival of a people's way of life versus an expanding federal authority, shaped the tone of negotiations and the urgency of military planning on both sides. When the council reached its decisions, discipline and improvisation combined. War chiefs organized rapid response groups around the camp's perimeter, while ceremonial leaders continued rites that bound families together. Skilled riders and scouts practiced trails and approach routes. The alliance's cohesion, however, was not uniform. Local band autonomy, differing priorities, and the sheer scale of the encampment meant that unity was constantly negotiated. The immediate outcome of this gathering altered the course of the campaign. It produced a mobilized, determined force capable of responding to incursions, and it forced federal commanders to reassess assumptions about the size and resolve of indigenous resistance. The longer consequences were even starker: escalating military reprisals, tightening of reservation controls, and the gradual erosion of the autonomy the councils had sought to defend. The march toward the river. As cavalry columns left the high ground and wound down toward the river, scouts sent urgent reports of a vast encampment clustered along the water's edge, horses milling, and smoke rising from many lodges. Consider subscribing for more measured historical narratives. The descent itself mattered. Steep bluffs gave way to timbered coulees and open prairie, and every change in terrain altered sightlines and the pace of advance. Men and horses moved with a mixture of haste and strain. Orders were short, and time pressure was constant. Commanders faced immediate practical problems. Supply and communication narrowed as the slope funneled troops into constrained approaches. Horses needed water and men needed clear lines of movement, but confusion over the size and disposition of the village created competing imperatives: to strike quickly before the people dispersed, and to keep units together to avoid being cut off. Scouts reported that the encampment extended across both banks, and that many of the tribe's animals were corralled near the river. The insistence on rapid maneuver left little room for consolidation. Messages did not always catch up with movements, so the regiment fragmented into separate detachments whose sight of one another vanished behind ridges and timber. From the Lakota and Cheyenne perspective, the march toward the river was not merely a tactical problem but a direct threat to the community gathered there. Non-combatants, women, children, elders, moved toward water and shelter. Herd animals, irreplaceable sources of food and mobility, were brought to the river and hidden in ravines. Warriors organized to place a protective ring between raiders and the camp. Swift riders took up positions on high ground and along river approaches. Familiarity with the river's bends, the stands of cottonwood, and the hidden gullies allowed defenders to contest the army's approach and to anticipate where an attack might come. This was protection of family and survival rather than a simple military engagement. Tactically, the move down from the bluffs exposed vulnerabilities that had profound consequences. Descending units lost the advantage of elevation and, in several places, became separated by ridgelines and timber. Control over mounted movement diminished when horses were tasked with drawing supply wagons, or when exhausted mounts could not keep pace. Command cohesion frayed as runners and scouts strained to maintain contact. The visual drama of the river bend, steam, dust, and a spread of lodges belied the logistical reality. A force advancing piecemeal into a populated and defended valley risked encirclement. That risk was not only theoretical. It altered the behavior of both sides, accelerating actions that, once begun, could not be easily undone. The immediate and long-term consequences of that descent were severe and intertwined. In the short term, the isolation of a detached command helped determine the outcome of the encounter. In the longer view, the clash that followed the march toward the river hardened public sentiment and policy on both sides, prompting increased military pressure, accelerated loss of traditional lands for Plains peoples, and further restrictions on their autonomy. For the Army, lessons were learned about reconnaissance, unit cohesion, and the dangers of underestimating opponents. For the native nations, the river became both a place of defense and a symbol of the wider struggle to protect families, resources, and homeland. The march itself, measured in dust and hoofbeats and the quiet movement of people toward water, stands in memory as a pivot, where tactical choices intersected with human imperatives and shaped the course of what followed. The battle unfolds. Subscribe for more balanced historical narratives. When Federal cavalry approached a large Plains encampment, commanders on both sides moved quickly and with conviction. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer divided his regiment into 3 battalions, sending Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen on separate missions while he led the remaining men on a rapid advance. Native leaders, including Sitting Bull in a spiritual and strategic role and Crazy Horse as a battlefield commander, marshaled warriors from the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho to defend families and lodges. Scouts on both sides reported different views of strength and disposition, and those conflicting reports shaped the first hours of combat. Reno struck first along the river bottom and met resistance in dense cottonwood and coulee country. His mounted charge quickly dissolved into disordered fighting on foot. He withdrew to higher ground and tried to reorganize under heavy pressure. Benteen, searching for Reno and awaiting orders, moved his companies across difficult terrain and encountered wounded soldiers and fleeing civilians. He established a defensive perimeter on a ridge and sent scouts to assess the situation. Meanwhile, Custer pushed ahead with the battalion he commanded, moving up a ridge and into a sweeping assault that soon ran into fierce, coordinated native opposition. The action unfolded in near-simultaneous episodes rather than a single, continuous clash. Native tactics combined rapid, mobile horsework with intimate knowledge of the terrain and a determination to protect non-combatants. Warriors interposed themselves between attackers and the village, cut off avenues of retreat, and exploited choke points among the river terraces and hills. In several localized fights, native forces repeatedly outmaneuvered separated U.S. detachments, isolating them and turning initial momentum into encirclement. Communication among U.S. commanders was fragmentary, orders were delayed, messages lost in smoke and dust, and once separated units could not rejoin quickly. These friction points in command and control are central to understanding how the battle progressed. Eyewitness accounts and native oral histories offered different focal points. Survivors on the U.S. side later described desperate, last-ditch stands and moments of small unit cohesion, while Lakota and Cheyenne narratives emphasize collective defense, the protection of women and children, and the rallying of whole villages. Archaeological surveys, mapping spent cartridge cases, bullet fragments, and camp debris, have since helped reconcile some discrepancies by indicating where troops moved and where fierce fighting was concentrated. Yet debate persists over precise troop dispositions and the sequence of some actions, and historians continue to weigh testimony against material evidence. The immediate consequence of the engagement was the collapse of separated U.S. detachments and the sudden end of offensive momentum on that field. Longer-term effects were profound. Public reaction, political pressure, and subsequent military campaigns intensified, altering the balance of power on the plains and accelerating policies that confined native nations to reservations. Memory of the battle also fractured into myth and analysis. It became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, intelligence gathering, cultural misunderstandings, and the tragic costs of collision between expansionist policy and indigenous resistance. In the end, the unfolding of the battle reads as a study in decision-making under uncertainty. Small tactical choices, when to press an attack, when to pause and consolidate, how to interpret scouts' reports, cascaded into decisive outcomes. For both sides it was a moment of valor and loss, shaped by strategy, terrain, and the human will to defend home and duty. Custer's last stand. This account examines the final actions of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and the detachment he led. If you value careful historical inquiry, consider subscribing for more nuanced examinations of contested events. Custer had broken his regiment into 3 battalions that day, ordering separate advances with the intention of surrounding an encampment. Scouts and cavalry troopers carried reports back and forth, and those reports were ambiguous. Some voices warned of a far larger gathering of Lakota, northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho than Custer expected. Against that uncertain picture he pressed forward, and the decision to engage without consolidated support shaped what followed. Tactical fragmentation proved decisive. One battalion under Major Reno made a hurried assault that faltered on the timbered river flats, forcing a retreat to higher ground. Another under Captain Benteen moved cautiously after receiving orders and pleas for support, arriving too late to affect the outcome for Custer. Custer's own battalion moved up a ridge and into a spreading confrontation. Witness accounts from native participants, coupled with later archaeological work mapping fired cartridge cases, show fighting in multiple locales and trajectories inconsistent with a single linear clash. The pattern that emerges is of a fast-moving, chaotic engagement that quickly overwhelmed the small command on the ridge. Perspectives differ starkly. From the Army's point of view, Custer was executing aggressive orders in a campaign meant to force compliance with federal demands. Many soldiers saw duty and obedience as paramount. From the Lakota, northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho perspectives, the encounter was a defensive exertion to protect families, horses, and a way of life under immediate threat from incursions and treaty violations. Leaders such as Sitting Bull served as spiritual focal points for resistance, while war leaders like Crazy Horse and Gaul marshaled warriors in tactical response. Crow scouts who accompanied the Army had warned of large numbers but could not alter the course of command decisions. Their testimony underscores the misreading of terrain and forces that shaped the outcome. Consequences radiated outward in political, cultural, and practical ways. In the immediate term, the loss shocked a nation and intensified calls for military reprisals, accelerating campaigns that ultimately constrained the mobility and autonomy of Plains peoples. Over time, a pervasive mythology grew around Custer and the Last Stand, used by different constituencies to justify policy or to mourn perceived heroism. That mythology often flattened the complexity of causes and the perspectives of native communities. Archaeology and careful scholarship in subsequent decades, mapping battle scatter, re-examining eyewitness testimony, and incorporating oral histories, have revised earlier simplifications and brought forward a more contested, more human account. Memory and meaning continue to evolve at the site itself. The battlefield is now maintained as a place of reflection where both military markers and native memorials coexist, and where descendants of those who fought return to assert their narratives and honor the dead. Today, the story is not only about a tactical failure or a dramatic loss, it is a prism for understanding federal policy, indigenous resistance, and how public memory is formed and reformed. The tragedy of that ridge altered lives and policies, and it remains a living subject for historians, archaeologists, and the communities whose ancestors were present that day. Aftermath and shock across America. If you find this account useful, consider subscribing. The defeat of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry at the river had an immediate, electric effect across the nation, turning a frontier skirmish into a headline that gripped newspapers from coast to coast. Photographs, engravings, and telegraph dispatches carried narrative as fast as the railroads. Editors framed the event in moral terms, and the public responded with a mixture of grief, anger, and fascination. Reports arrived that native leaders had routed U.S. soldiers, and that imagery, portraits of fallen troopers and dramatic sketches of the fight, began to define popular understanding almost as quickly as the facts could be verified. Reaction was complex and contradictory. Many citizens mourned the dead as martyrs to westward expansion and personal sacrifice. Others saw the loss as proof of misplaced command and the perils of underestimating organized resistance. At the same time, accounts of battlefield mutilations circulated widely, inflaming a sense of outrage and hardening attitudes in political and military circles. The press did not speak with one voice. Some writers sought contextual explanations, pointing to logistics, flawed intelligence, and the overreach of a fast-moving campaign. Others sought simple narratives of heroism and betrayal. Short outrage. Long analysis followed. Native perspectives were less visible in the first days but no less consequential. Leaders who had won a tactical victory recognized that a broader strategic war was likely to follow. There was elation but also apprehension. For many Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho individuals and bands, the victory brought a temporary reprieve from immediate forced removal, yet it also provoked intensified federal resolve. Some warriors and families moved to seek safety beyond U.S. military reach. Others debated whether further resistance would preserve autonomy or bring faster ruin to food supplies and winter camps. The short-term elation collided with the long-term reality of diminishing buffalo herds and encroaching settlements. The federal response was swift in intent and slow in mercy. Military leaders reinforced campaigns on the plains and logistical priorities shifted toward rapid suppression and containment. Policymakers in Washington faced pressure to act decisively. Increased troop deployments and stricter enforcement of reservation boundaries followed. Meanwhile, memory work began. Custer's widow mounted a visible effort to shape her husband's legacy through lectures and writings, and a mythic portrait of the event, framed as a tragic last stand, took hold in popular culture. Short-lived triumph for one side deepened the stakes for the other. Consequences extended beyond immediate military reprisals to long-term shifts in indigenous life and American politics. Plains communities confronted accelerated loss of territory, constrained mobility, and rising dependency on government annuities and rations. Internal schisms widened between those advocating continued armed resistance and those seeking negotiated refuge on reservations. In public life, the battle catalyzed debates over how the nation would meet the Indian question, debates that would increasingly favor assimilationist policies and tighter federal control. The site itself became an icon, then a contested symbol, memorialized in monuments, contested in scholarship, and revisited in the work of descendants and historians who continue to argue over memory, meaning, and consequence. Short sentence to close. The legend, the truth, and the cost. If this account resonates, please subscribe for more carefully told historical documentaries. The clash near the Little Bighorn River pitched the United States 7th Cavalry against a confederation of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, and it ended with the annihilation of a portion of that command and a decisive, if short-lived, victory for the indigenous defenders. The scene was shaped by decades of contested land, treaty violations, and the mass movement of people and buffalo across the plains, underlying causes that turned a tactical encounter into a turning point in a larger struggle. Leaders on the indigenous side, prominent among them figures remembered in oral history as resolute and strategic, mobilized warriors from multiple bands, while on the other side a mixture of aggressive scouting, fractured command decisions, and assumptions about enemy strength produced fatal vulnerabilities. The myth grew quickly and loudly. Newspapers and popular culture fixed a dramatic image of a lone, gallant commander standing against overwhelming odds, a tableau that supplied a nation with an emblem of sacrifice and courage. Monuments, paintings, and dime novels stretched the moment into legend. But legend simplified. It made heroes out of chosen figures and compressed complex motivations into tidy narratives that suited political needs and collective memory. The short, sensational accounts that followed the battle obscured the realities on the ground, the contingency of plans, the limits of intelligence, and the agency of native fighters whose own stories were too often reduced to background. Careful inquiry in the years since has rebalanced the record. Archaeological surveys, forensic analysis, and indigenous oral testimony have offered a fuller mosaic. Cartridge clusters that map movements across ridges, family accounts that speak to leadership and strategy, and divergent eyewitness recollections that challenge early official reports. Historians now emphasize that tactical mistakes mattered, divided forces, inadequate scouting, and an underestimation of the coalition's numbers and resolve, but so did the broader policy context that provoked armed resistance. From the native perspective, the action was not a desperate act of aggression but a defense of homeland, food sources, and sovereignty. From the military and political perspective it became, in the aftermath, a narrative of outrage that demanded response. The costs were profound and multifaceted. Lives were lost on both sides. The human toll extended beyond combatants to families and communities whose cultures and economies depended on mobility and the buffalo herds that were themselves being destroyed. Politically, the victory did not halt the larger campaign to confine Plains peoples to reservations. Instead, it hardened resolve in Washington and among frontier settlers, prompting greater military investment and an intensified push to subdue resistant bands. Socially, the battle accelerated policies of removal, assimilation, and cultural suppression that inflicted long-term damage on indigenous societies. The mythic framing of the conflict also carried its own cost, legitimizing narratives that justified those policies and delaying honest reckoning. Today, the landscape of memory is changing. The battlefield is preserved and interpreted with increasing attention to multiple voices. Museums and national sites work with descendant communities to present ceremonies, remembrances, and research that honor indigenous perspectives alongside military records. Scholarship continues to correct earlier oversimplifications, and descendants on all sides seek reconciliation with the past without erasing its pain. The episode endures as a study in how stories are shaped by power, and in how truth, when recovered from both archives and oral traditions, can humanize all who were caught in the sweep of empire and resistance. If this exploration resonated, please subscribe for more thoughtful histories. In closing, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 must be understood not as an isolated spectacle but as the moment when long building pressures, broken treaties, the rush for land and gold, and conflicting worldviews about sovereignty and the land, met on the plains. From the perspective of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the engagement was an act of defense for people, family, and way of life. From the perspective of the United States Army, it was a campaign shaped by orders, miscalculation, and the politics of expansion. The immediate outcome was loss and displacement. The longer consequence was intensified military pressure, accelerated confinement to reservations, and a legacy of grievance and legal struggle that continues to shape American life. These are human stories of courage, misjudgment, and sorrow on all sides. As you reflect, consider whose voices have been recorded and whose remain unheard, and how acknowledging that complexity matters to our understanding of the past. If you have questions, sources, or perspectives, share them below with respect and curiosity. In upcoming episodes, we will examine the treaties before the conflict, the Black Hill seizure, and the enduring lives of the communities affected. Thank you for watching. Remembering history carefully is part of moving toward a more just future.